July 1944. The war in Europe still burned fiercely. The trains that clattered through the Texas plains carried something no local had ever witnessed before. Young German women in uniform, escorted by American soldiers with sun-reddened faces and weary eyes. Among them was 19-year-old Liesl Weber. She had been told countless stories about Americans, that they were savage, crude, and merciless toward captives. She expected to be spat on, degraded, perhaps even harmed. But when she stepped down from the rail car into the blistering Texas heat, something unexpected happened. A man in a Stetson hat with a thick southern drawl offered her a cold drink. His grin was warm, not mocking. Another handed her a lemon-scented handkerchief, as if welcoming a guest rather than guarding an enemy. The air smelled of hay and dust. The guards weren't shouting. The locals were waving. Liesl tightened her grip on her worn canvas bag. She had braced herself for a nightmare, yet standing there, boots sinking into dry earth, she began to realize this wasn't the America she had been warned about. And she wasn't the only one who would soon see her captors in a different light. The propaganda they believed. Long before she ever saw Texas, Liesl had been trained to fear it. By the final years of Nazi Germany, the regime controlled every word of information. Newsreels painted Americans as beasts, soldiers who desecrated bodies, bombed civilians, and lived in lands overrun by chaos and inferior races. In classrooms, teachers whispered, "If the Allies take you, they will kill you. Or worse, especially if you're a woman." Liesl had grown up in Berlin, surviving on ration cards and huddling through air raids. By 17, she had already lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. She volunteered as a Luftwaffe auxiliary, hoping to serve her country and help the wounded. Instead, she was captured by American troops near a munitions depot in France, just weeks after D-Day. Rumors began early aboard the transport ship bound for America. The women, crammed below deck, were seasick and terrified. Someone claimed a French girl had been mistreated by her guards. Another whispered that prisoners had been thrown overboard. There was no evidence, but fear doesn't rely on proof. It only needs repetition. By the time they reached U.S. shores, most had made a silent promise to themselves: obey, avoid attention, survive. But nothing they encountered resembled what they'd been taught. The train westward rolled past endless cornfields and quiet towns, past signs in English they couldn't read, past people who smiled and waved. Families stood on porches. Children raced beside the cars, laughing. An old man tipped his hat. One of the girls began to cry softly. "Why are they smiling?" she asked. No one answered. They arrived at Camp Hearn, one of several POW camps scattered across the American South, built for thousands of captured Germans, mostly men. Now, it made space for a small group of women. These weren't hardened SS guards or concentration camp staff. Most were clerks, nurses, typists, support personnel who wore the enemy's uniform but had never fired a weapon. At the entrance, a sign read, "Geneva Convention observed here." It felt like a trap. Yet the guards were young Americans, farm boys barely older than the women themselves. They weren't cruel. They were quiet, almost awkward. One even helped a girl carry her suitcase. Inside, the surprise only deepened. There was a library, an art room, even a choir rehearsing near a small chapel. The barracks were plain but clean. There were fences, yes, and rules, but no dogs, no blows, no hatred. Only order, discipline, and a strange kind of decency. Liesl noticed a bulletin board near the mess hall. Posted schedules, typed in both English and German, listed work shifts, chapel hours, and even movie nights. American films, someone muttered, "This can't be real." They thought it was a trick, to win them over through kindness. But the routine didn't change. The food was unusual but plentiful. Eggs, sausages, even pie. The guards greeted them with nods, sometimes a shy "Guten Morgen." No one touched them without consent. Gradually the tension eased. The women began to speak more freely, to laugh again. One warm afternoon, Lysel stood by the fence, watching a group of young Americans tossing horseshoes in the sun. Country music floated from a nearby radio. "This doesn't feel like prison," she whispered to her friend. The other woman just smiled, brushing dust from her skirt. Something unspoken was changing. The enemy was becoming human, and beyond the fence, curiosity bloomed. Townsfolk had heard that real German prisoners, even women, were in their midst. Some expected monsters. What they saw instead were frightened girls, barely out of school, trying to stay proud in a foreign land. Arrival in Texas, a culture shock. Camp Hearn was a contradiction. Outside, barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, it felt more like a small college campus. Red gravel paths, pine trees, and whitewashed buildings. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and soap. Not terror. For women like Lysel, the difference was dizzying. Each morning brought not shouts or boots, but the sound of bells and birds. The guards, young GIs from Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, treated them with distant respect. They followed orders, but didn't delight in authority. Some even showed small kindnesses. Lysel's bunkmate, Helga, was startled when a guard quietly handed her an extra bar of soap. "What's the catch?" she asked. There wasn't one. The rules were clear. No one left without escort, no fraternizing, English preferred but German allowed, no political talk. Within those limits, life was unexpectedly calm. There was work, cooking, cleaning, tending gardens, but also leisure. The women formed sewing circles, volunteered in the greenhouse, and joined English classes to decipher the language of their captors. Inga, once a pianist before the war, found a dusty upright piano in the chapel. She began playing each evening. First German folk songs, then, after hearing jazz on the radio, a bit of Gershwin. Soon American guards gathered outside to listen quietly. No one said it aloud, but something profound was happening. The distance between enemy and person was shrinking. Still, the world outside the camp remained a mystery. The nearest town, Hearn, was a dusty Texas dot on the map. Its population had never seen German soldiers, especially not female ones. Rumors spread quickly that the prisoners were dangerous or fanatical, or perhaps even witches. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Sometimes local farmers would drive past the camp slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse. Children dared each other to sneak up to the fence. One Sunday afternoon, a teenage boy tossed a baseball over the wire on purpose, then asked in broken German if someone would throw it back. A girl named Marta did, smiling. The boy waved. She waved back. That was the entire exchange. But for Marta, it meant something. For the first time since capture, she didn't feel like a criminal. Then came the harvest season. By late summer of 1944, American farms were desperate for labor. Mostable-bodied men were off fighting in Europe or the Pacific. The War Department approved a new program: allow carefully screened prisoners, including women, to work under supervision on local farms and ranches. It would help the economy and keep the PWS active. The risk was considered low, and so, just weeks after their arrival, German women in uniform began stepping through the gates, not as fugitives, but as farm hands. For the first time, they saw the real America. They rode in pickup trucks through endless fields of cotton and corn. They walked into barns where radio music played through static and horses snickered in the dark. They met ranchers and widows, housewives and teenagers. They were watched closely. Yes, but they were also talked to, occasionally teased, and more often than not, treated with something they had never expected: kindness. Lysel was assigned to a dairy farm run by an older couple named Tom and Ruth. They didn't ask her about the war. They asked if she wanted lemonade. When she made a mistake milking the cows, Ruth laughed and said, "Honey, you'll get it next time." It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it wasn't hatred either. On the way back to camp that evening, Liesl looked out the truck window. The sunset turned the Texas sky into fire. Somewhere behind her, the war still raged. But out here in this wide, strange, generous land, something inside her had shifted. She was still a prisoner, but she no longer felt like the enemy. Love in the time of barbed wire. At first, it was just a glance, a sideways look from the back of a truck, a nod across a dusty field, a quiet hello from a young American man driving a tractor. The Geneva Convention said nothing about chemistry. The women were supposed to be watched at all times. But the realities of rural Texas made that difficult. Fields stretched for miles. Supervisors were often busy or simply indifferent. And in the open air, far from the war rooms of Berlin or Washington, human nature took over. Marta was the first to admit she'd fallen. Her letters home, heavily censored, hinted at someone named Jay, a local farm hand who sang while he worked and brought her wild flowers when no one was looking. She didn't know his politics. She didn't care. He made her laugh. And for the first time in years, she felt young. Liesl, too, began noticing things. John, the rancher's son, was quiet and strong, with hands that told of hard work and a voice that held none of the arrogance she expected from Americans. He didn't speak German. She barely spoke English. But they found a rhythm. She helped with the horses. He showed her how to mend a fence. He let her ride just once when his mother wasn't looking. He never called her Kraut. She never told him she once prayed for a Nazi victory. It was a slow unraveling of suspicion. The myths they'd been told about cruelty, corruption, and inhumanity fell apart with every shared task, every shy smile. They began to see each other not as enemies, but as people caught in a storm neither of them had started. But not everyone approved. Some local families were outraged. "Our boys are dying overseas," they said. "And these girls are having picnics with the enemy." A Baptist preacher delivered a fiery sermon about the seduction of Christian men by foreign women who once served Hitler. One farmer reported his neighbor for harboring Germans in his barn. The army issued a quiet warning. Fraternization is discouraged. But enforcement was lax. Why? Because the war was winding down and everyone, even the guards, was tired. Tired of death, tired of fear, tired of pretending the world made sense. So, the rules blurred. At night, when the guards relaxed and the air cooled, something remarkable happened. In barns and fields, in secret groves just beyond the perimeter, dances were held. Not official, not sanctioned, but very real. Someone would sneak in a radio. Someone else would bring Coca-Cola or cigarettes. And under the stars, American farm boys and German prisoner girls swayed to Glenn Miller and swing. They didn't talk politics. They didn't talk war. They talked about movies, about food, about where they were before the world broke apart. One woman, Greta, later wrote in her memoir, "I remember dancing in bare feet on the dirt floor of an old shed, my hair unbraided, his hands careful but sure. For 10 minutes, I forgot I was a prisoner. I remembered I was a girl." Some of the guards looked the other way. Others quietly guarded the events from a distance, not to stop them, but to protect them, because somehow everyone understood this was healing. Even in war, there are cracks where light gets in. By early 1945, at least a dozen women in Camp Hearn were believed to be romantically involved with locals, either farmers, guards, or townsfolk. Rumors swirled, but few were punished. One woman was transferred after being caught kissing an Italy American soldier behind the supply shed. Another was quietly reassigned to indoor duties when a rancher's wife accused her of seducing her son. But most were left alone. These were not grand affairs. They were small, fragile things built on stolen time and forbidden glances. And yet they endured. Because when everything else had been taken, their homes, their nations, their futures, these women still had hearts. And somehow, miraculously, Those hearts found others willing to hold them. The war ends and hearts break. On May 8, 1945, the world changed. Word spread through the camp like a summer fire. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For the women at Camp Hearn, it was a moment of silence more than celebration. No cheering, no tears, just stillness. Some stood frozen in their work clothes, unsure what came next. They had dreamed of peace, but not like this. Not as prisoners, not in a country they'd once called monstrous. Not with letters from home that arrived, fewer and fewer, some never arriving at all. Within days, the War Department issued instructions. All prisoners would be processed for repatriation. For the women, it meant returning to a country in ruins, cities bombed to ash, families scattered, ideologies dead. For Liesl, it meant leaving John. They sat under the cotton tree one last time, the same place they had first spoken, without words. She had learned to say, "I don't want to go." And he had learned enough to reply, "I know." There was no marriage license, no paperwork, just promises. "I'll find a way," he said. She didn't believe him, not because he was lying, but because the world had always found a way to break what they'd built. At the train station, dozens of women stood with canvas bags and folded uniforms. Some held hands with Americans, others just stared at the platform. No one spoke much. When the whistle blew, Liesl looked back. John was still there, hat in hand, eyes full of something she couldn't name. Not sorrow, not hope, something in between. The train pulled away. Back in Germany, the welcome was cold. The women were treated with suspicion, some even with contempt. "You surrendered too easily," one official said. Others were labeled traitors for having worked in soft posts. Some towns refused to acknowledge them. Jobs were scarce, food scarcer. But Liesl carried something with her noon could confiscate. A photograph of a ranch and a name. John Miller. She wrote a letter. Months passed. Then an answer came. He had been trying too. There was a new program, she learned, called the War Bride Act. Though originally intended for women who married American GIS in Europe, a loophole allowed former prisoners under very specific conditions to return and marry American citizens. It took petitions, letters, affidavit from the rancher's family. But in the spring of 1946, Liesl boarded another ship. This time, not as a prisoner, but as a fiancée. She arrived in New York, wearing a borrowed coat and holding a slip of paper with John's address. In Texas, he was waiting at the station. He wore the same hat. He didn't say anything, had just held her. They were married that summer, and they were not alone across the country. In quiet corners of states like Texas, Georgia, and Iowa, dozens of German women returned, not as repatriates, but as wives. Some had met their husbands through farm work, others through church programs, others, like Liesl, through luck and impossible persistence. By 1950, over 200 former German PS, male and female, had legally immigrated back to the U.S., sponsored by Americans who had once been their jailers, employers, or lovers. Their jailers, employers, or lovers. In Hearn, neighbors whispered, but most eventually accepted. After all, she worked hard. She smiled often. She baked better bread than anyone in town. John never talked much about how they met. He just said she was a gift from a war that took too much. Not every story ended so sweetly. Some women returned and were never heard from again. Others married but divorced within years, unable to bridge the gap between two worlds. But for those who made it, who stayed, something deeper remained. They weren't just survivors. They were proof that even after the bloodiest war in human history, love could still win. From enemy to Texan, they were no longer prisoners, but they would never fully be Americans either, at least not on paper. Yet in spirit, in the quiet routines of rural life, in the pies baked and babies raised, In the songs hummed while folding laundry on back porches, they became something else entirely. Texans. Liesl and John built a small home on the edge of his father's ranch. It had 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a front porch with a swing. Liesl planted sunflowers, though they didn't take at first. The soil was too dry. She learned to mend jeans instead of uniforms. Her accent never faded, but her neighbors did. At first, people were cautious. The war was still fresh. Newspapers ran stories of Nuremberg. The word German still drew side eyes. At church, some sat a row away. One woman crossed the street when Liesl came into town. But time is persistent. It erodes even the hardest stone. Liesl started helping at the local schoolhouse. She taught children how to say their names in German, how to sing O Tannenbaum. She knitted blankets for church raffles. She baked strudels for county fairs. And slowly, people stopped seeing her as that German girl. She became Miss Liesl, then Mrs. Miller, then simply one of their own. She wasn't alone. Another former prisoner, Greta, opened a small cafe in Austin with her American husband. The walls were painted sky blue and the menu had schnittle next to chili. Her daughter spoke English with a Texas twang and learned to say grace before dinner. A custom Greta had once found strange, even childlike. One woman, Annalise, married a widowed preacher and became a Sunday school teacher. Another became a nurse, caring for the same types of veterans who once guarded her. The irony was never lost on them. "I was trained to fear these people," one woman said. "Now they trust me with their children." Not everyone's journey was easy. Some marriages buckled under pressure. A few women left quietly, returning to a new West Germany that barely remembered them. But most stayed, not out of necessity, but out of conviction. They had chosen this place, this life, these people. By the 1960s, their children were joining the U.S. Army, playing football in American high schools, marching in 4th of July parades. One of Liesl's sons would serve in Vietnam. Another became a teacher. She kept a small box under her bed with her old uniform neatly folded, a pressed flower from the day she met John, and the train ticket from her repatriation in 1945. She never spoke bitterly about Germany, but when asked if she missed it, she'd smile and say, "No one offers you lemonade on a train in Berlin." Over time, the town forgot the details. Which farm? Which guard? Which camp? But they remembered the feeling that somehow, despite everything, something beautiful had grown from the wreckage. Decades later, when John passed away, the funeral was packed. Liesl sat in the front row, hands folded. A local pastor, who hadn't even been born when the war ended, gave the eulogy. He mentioned her only once. And by his side, through every trial and triumph, was Liesl, a woman who taught us that grace can come from the most unexpected places. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Liesl sat alone on the porch swing, sipping tea. The cicadas hummed. The land lay still. She gazed across the field, the same one where she once picked cotton, once fell in love, once learned to ride. And she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "I came here as a prisoner, but I was set free." And then there was one last letter. Time, as always, accomplished what war could not. It smoothed the sharp edges. It blurred the uniforms. It carried both old soldiers and young lovers into silence. Liesl Miller lived a long, full life. She outlasted her husband, her brothers and sisters, even some of her children. Yet she never left Texas. She never stopped baking rye bread every Sunday, never stopped hanging her laundry in the dry wind or humming lullabies that drifted off the porch like ghosts from another time. She seldom spoke of the war, not because she had secrets, but because the war had already taken more than enough. Near the twilight of her years, when her granddaughter Anna asked where she truly came from, Liesl handed her a letter. It was dated July 3, 1995. She wrote, "You ask me why I never returned. I did, in dreams, in letters, in the sound of trains. But I left Berlin as a girl taught to fear what she didn't understand. I arrived in Texas, still wrapped in that fear, like a heavy coat. But America made me shed it. Not all at once, but bit by bit, with every act of kindness, every shared meal, every time someone offered me a glass of lemonade instead of a weapon, I found peace here. Not because it was simple, but because it was human. They told me the enemy had no heart, but this place taught me the truth. The enemy smiles, too." Liesl passed away later that same year. At her funeral, 3 former guards from Camp Hearn came to pay their respects. So did neighbors, old church friends, and a handful of locals who remembered the whispers about her past. By then, those rumors had turned into legend. Her gravestone reads, "Born in Berlin, died in Brenham. Loved both." Somewhere in the IDE back of a dusty photo album lies a snapshot from 1946. A German girl in a simple cotton dress beside a tall man in a cowboy hat. They're smiling, not posing, just smiling. She came to America in captivity. She stayed for love. And in doing so, she rewrote what it meant to be an enemy. Not with speeches or revolutions, but with the quiet courage of staying when every voice urged her to leave. Because sometimes history doesn't end with a treaty. Sometimes it ends with a wedding ring. The story of German POWs in America remains one of the most unexpected chapters of World War II. It wasn't about tanks or bombings or grand acts of valor. It was about kitchen tables, front porches, and broken souls finding wholeness in a land they once feared. Altogether, more than 400,000 German prisoners were held in the United States during the war. While the vast majority were men, a few hundred, women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, shared their fate. Most went back home, but a few chose to stay. Not because they had to, but because they fell in love. Not just with people, but with an idea. The idea that an enemy can become a neighbor, and that forgiveness, though it comes slowly, is still possible.